Life Mindset channel greets everyone. The trade war between China and the US continues to stir panic among many people. US tariffs on China have risen from 125% to 145%. Yet, if you examine President Trump's social media, you'll notice he has not posted anything about this additional 20% tariff. So where did this extra tariff come from? Furthermore, a major issue is emerging. While President Trump has temporarily spared other countries, he continues to focus solely on China. Could this be a trap President Trump had set up beforehand? Or is he acting impulsively and figuring out the strategy as he goes? Currently, tariffs hang over China like a looming threat, putting immense pressure on them. How will President Xi Jinping and China respond? Will they maintain their firm stance? What actions has China taken in retaliation? Interestingly, China is considering appealing to America's allies to gather support against the US. But the outcome was surprising. These allies exposed China's plans. In essence, China is facing an unprecedented crisis. What exactly is going on? Before we delve into the analysis, we invite our viewers to like and subscribe to the channel. In the past, it was believed that President Trump had imposed a 125% tariff on China. However, on April 10th, the White House officially clarified that President Trump had declared an additional 125% tariff on China on April 9th. This new tariff is added on top of the 20% tariff that had already been imposed. The White House further explained that these tariffs took effect on April 10th, with the 20% tariff being specifically related to China's failure to address illegal immigration and the flow of fentanyl into the US. In other words, the White House clarified that the 20% tariff was tied to fentanyl and illegal immigration, while the new 125% tariff addresses the trade balance issue. These are two separate matters, but together they total 145%. This means that after 2 rounds of tariffs being imposed back and forth, most imports from China to the US are now subject to a 145% tariff, while China has applied an 84% tariff on most imports from the US. The 145% tariff was set by President Trump during his presidency. Of course, some may think the difference between a 104% and 140% tariff is minor, as both are burdensome for businesses on both sides. However, in reality, the difference is quite significant. But we won't delve too deeply into the specifics. First, let's take a broader look at the current state of the trade war. It is clear that President Trump's strategy is straightforward. He aims to use this approach to align with allies and collectively target China. On April 9th, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, during a speech at the American Bankers Association in Washington, responded to questions from journalists. He stated that the U.S. may ultimately reach an agreement with its allies, who have always been strong military partners, but not necessarily perfect economic ones. Once that agreement is reached, the U.S. could act as a unified bloc to address the issue with China. Additionally, Scott Bessent warned the European Union not to consider siding with China or distancing itself from the US. He specifically called out Spain, saying that if Spain decided to align with China, it would be akin to cutting off its own escape routes. The central message in Scott Bessent's speech was that he wants to reach a consensus with allies to handle China as a unified group. It's very clear that he hopes these allies can coordinate and impose tariffs on China together to correct the trade imbalance and prevent China from engaging in dumping practices. We also know that the European Union has a significant trade deficit with China, ranging from 200 to 300 billion US dollars, a substantial amount. Furthermore, Scott Bessent's explicit mention of Spain and his warning against aligning with China indicates that this isn't just about trade imbalances, it's about choosing sides. If a country chooses the opposing side, there will be no turning back. Let's now turn our attention to the stance of the US allies, with the European Union being the most significant, as it is the third largest global economy. The EU has adopted 2 distinct positions. The first is a temporary pause on the 25% retaliatory tariffs on US steel and aluminum for a period of 90 days. Essentially, if the US decides to suspend its tariffs, the EU will also hold off for 90 days, allowing both sides to have time to discuss matters. The second position is more accommodating. EU Energy Commissioner Dan Jerson publicly expressed that the EU plans to purchase additional liquefied natural gas from the US in an effort to reduce the trade deficit between the two regions. This gesture comes in response to President Trump's earlier demand that the EU should buy at least $350 billion worth of energy from the US before any future trade negotiations. In the past, many believed that zero tariffs would benefit global trade because it promotes free market exchange. However, the reality is far more complex. President Trump's objective is straightforward. He isn't just seeking zero tariffs like many might expect. His primary aim is to correct trade imbalances, ideally aiming for a zero or near zero trade deficit to ensure that the US isn't overly disadvantaged. Given Trump's approach, he likely intends to recover some of the financial gains that other countries have made at the US's expense. This is the mindset driving his actions. Japan, another important US ally, has also shown its resolve. A representative from Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry publicly stated that should any unfair practices be identified under WTO rules, Japan would consider imposing measures against steel imports from China. This issue is far from insignificant. It marks the first time that Japan has explicitly stated its intention to take action against China. Although, at present, Japan is focusing solely on steel imports, there is a possibility that they may expand their efforts to other sectors if necessary. Another notable country, which is not formally an ally of the US but currently maintains very close ties with it, is Vietnam. Amid the broader shift in President Trump's strategy, Vietnam has emerged as one of the biggest beneficiaries. It's widely recognized that Vietnam enjoys a significant trade surplus with the US, ranking third after China and Mexico. Each year, Vietnam exports more than $100 billion worth of goods to the US, with a major surplus in sectors like garments, electronics, and consumer goods. As a result, not only has Vietnam's stock market seen significant growth, but its NA stock price also jumped by 11% on April 9th, a remarkable increase. On April 8th, Vietnam's Deputy Prime Minister visited Washington to meet with US trade representatives and Congress members to engage in discussions. The outcome of these talks revealed that both parties have essentially reached an agreement to initiate negotiations for a trade deal. This deal will focus on removing non-tariff barriers and laying the groundwork for increased US investments in Vietnam, potentially through policy incentives. A key takeaway from the negotiations is that both sides have agreed to prioritize efforts to address trade fraud. The US has decided to temporarily suspend tariffs on Vietnam for 90 days. It's important to focus on the key point here, the emphasis on addressing trade fraud. What exactly is trade fraud? Many people will immediately recognize that this refers to Chinese companies that have relocated to Vietnam to assemble products and then export them to the US under the guise of Vietnamese goods. This is considered trade fraud. Therefore, this issue is significant. Vietnam, as the leading country in ASEAN, joining forces with the US to counter China, could have a ripple effect throughout the ASEAN bloc, placing immense pressure on China. Now, let's take a closer look at the mutual misjudgments made by both the US and China. Both President Trump and President Xi Jinping have made mistakes in their understanding of each other. President Trump consistently believed that China would inevitably come to the negotiating table and eventually strike a deal. This belief was grounded in the simple calculation of power. He assumed China was too weak and not foolish enough to engage in a direct confrontation with the US. By 2024, China's GDP will be roughly 65% of the US GDP, a decline from the peak of 77% in 2021, and it is expected to continue falling. Moreover, China's economic structure remains problematic, with an overly low consumption rate and excessive reliance on exports. China's capital market and social welfare system are fragile, and an economy in such a condition cannot withstand a major shock. This is President Trump's perspective, but he clearly overlooked a crucial element of Xi Jinping's strategy. When the US-China conflict escalated to a certain point, it actually worked in Xi's favor by helping him maintain power. Those who opposed him were concerned that any change in the situation could result in them losing everything, which made them hesitate. This hesitation allowed Xi to consolidate power during the crisis. Additionally, some draw comparisons to China's involvement in the Korean War in the 1950s, which also caught the US by surprise. At that time, China's military and economic strength was extremely weak, and the country had just emerged from a devastating civil war. Engaging in direct conflict with the US appeared unwise. But didn't Mao Zedong do exactly that? The context of China's considerations during the Korean War in the 1950s is vastly different from today, so it's not a straightforward comparison. Back then, China's primary objective was not economic recovery, but securing international support. China had won the Civil War with assistance from the Soviet Union, and for its survival, it needed Soviet backing. However, the Soviet Union's support had its limits, as it had just endured the devastation of World War II and was severely weakened. Stalin's focus was primarily on Europe, not Asia. Therefore, when China intervened in Korea, it effectively captured Soviet attention, ensuring that China would eventually have the military foundation needed to confront the West. The Soviet Union then increased its support, helping China build industrial projects and strengthen its position. The key point in the 1950s was that China entered the Korean War in order to gain support from the Soviet Union, thereby laying the groundwork for its industrialization. However, today, Xi Jinping's decision to confront President Trump while aiming to return US-China trade to zero is not about building a tariff alliance against the US, and the current global situation is vastly different from the 1950s. Why make such a decision? This line of thinking seems disorganized and internally contradictory. While Xi Jinping may gain some advantage from the ongoing crisis, it remains just one perspective to consider when analyzing the situation. Looking at the situation from any angle, it may not seem rational, but from Xi Jinping's perspective, it could make sense. President Trump, on the other hand, hasn't fully accounted for this factor. As a seasoned businessman, all of his experience comes from the US business world. Over the past few years, his approach has been to work with the cards he's been dealt, confident that, despite any twists and turns, the outcome will favor him. Is this the right approach? Very likely it is. This could explain why Xi Jinping misinterprets Trump's strategy. The misunderstanding lies not only in Xi thinking that China truly has the upper hand or that it can cover up its power gaps with clever tactics, but also in his fundamentally flawed perception of the global landscape. Xi Jinping believes that the freedom of speech, diversity of interests, and limited governments found in democratic nations are their weaknesses. He uses China's own advantages to exploit these perceived weaknesses, which fuels his confidence and gives him the impression that victory is within reach. However, we know that societies based on consensus, like democratic nations or republics with limited government, are often better suited to engaging in total wars. This is because when two opponents are roughly equal in size, such as the US and China, a democratic country will take much longer to reach a decision about whether to engage in conflict. This results in lower efficiency and many debates. However, once a democratic nation decides to engage in conflict, it is not a minor confrontation, but a comprehensive effort that will likely continue until its objectives are fully achieved. It will not stop after small victories. This is something China may not fully appreciate in its current confidence. Unlike nations like China, where leaders can act independently without needing broad consensus, China cannot provoke a strong democratic nation like the US without facing serious consequences. When China antagonizes the US, there will be significant repercussions. Therefore, while China can test certain limits with small provocations, crossing the line could lead to disastrous outcomes. The well-known quote, "When goods cannot cross borders, armies will," may raise concerns. But in reality, this scenario is unlikely to unfold because the US still holds significant negotiating power. The US is actively reshaping global rules, while countries are now tied to smaller, competing tariff blocs. The logic behind these alliances mirrors the way colonial empires operated in the 1930s, but today's global context is entirely different. President Trump's tariffs act as a hammer, dismantling the existing system to restart negotiations with the goal of balancing trade relations. The ultimate objective is to avoid a future crisis. It is important to understand this distinction. Today's tariffs are intended to prevent a crisis, not merely respond to one that has already caused widespread economic turmoil. President Trump is taking a proactive approach, using tariffs as a powerful tool to address various issues. By the first quarter of this year, however, the U.S. job market remains robust, corporate profits are steady, and the country's economic foundation is intact. This indicates that other countries are still highly reliant on the U.S. market. President Trump is strategically using tariffs to disrupt the current system and then rebuild it. China's only viable option is to form alliances with other countries to counter the U.S. In other words, China's escape strategy is essentially trying to revert to a model from the 1930s, creating multiple competing tariff blocs. However, the current global context is vastly different from the 1930s. Back then, tariff blocs were rooted in colonial systems, where smaller nations were coerced into following the lead of larger powers. Trump's clear strategy is proving effective, and it is evident that China is losing ground. As President Trump issues ultimatums, China may be forced to adopt more aggressive tactics. This could result in even greater pressure being placed on China, creating a tighter circle of opposition. Consequently, China's options may become limited to forming coalitions against the US or risking further isolation on the global stage.